The clatter of cutlery and the murmur of 100 conversations usually formed a comforting symphony in the daily dish, a bustling diner known for its reliably greasy burgers and bottomless coffee. Tonight, however, the familiar sounds were merely a thin veil, barely muffling the sharp, pointed barbs that sliced through the air, aimed with cruel precision at table 7. Ethan Vance, a man whose shoulders carried a weariness that had nothing to do with the day's manual labor and everything to do with the quiet, relentless burden of solitary parenthood, felt each word land like a well-placed punch, though his face remained a placid mask. He gently dabbed a napkin at the corner of his 6-year-old son, Leo's mouth, a smear of ketchup the only disruption on the boy's otherwise cheerful face, while the snickering from the adjacent booth grew bolder, more insistent, transforming the background hum of the restaurant into a hostile, mocking echo. This wasn't just casual conversation from the group of men in the booth to his left. It was an escalating campaign, carefully orchestrated to chip away at his composure, to highlight his perceived inadequacy. "Look at that, fellas." A booming voice, drenched in a thick, self-satisfied drawl, cut across the room, though not quite loudly enough to draw the attention of the harried waitstaff. A single dad, all by his lonesome. Guess some women just know when to cut their losses, huh? A chorus of low chuckles followed, a predatory sound that grated against the otherwise cheerful atmosphere of the diner. Ethan felt Leo stiffen slightly beside him, his small hand instinctively reaching for his father's, a silent plea for protection against the unseen enemy. The boy, still young enough to find the world largely a place of wonder, was nevertheless acutely attuned to the subtle shifts in his father's demeanor and the sudden tension that now clung to Ethan like an unwelcome shroud. The casual nature of the insult, delivered with such practiced ease, spoke volumes about the speaker's character, revealing a man who likely found sport in such public displays of dominance, particularly over those he perceived as weaker or vulnerable. The daily dish was precisely what its name suggested: an everyday establishment, a cornerstone of the community where families came for predictable comfort food and friends gathered for lively chatter. Its walls, adorned with faded sepia photographs of local landmarks and high school football teams from decades past, exuded an aura of unpretentious history. Booths upholstered in worn, scarlet vinyl lined the perimeter, while sturdy formica tables filled the center, each bearing the faint, ghostly rings of countless coffee cups. The air was thick with the comforting aromas of sizzling bacon, sweet maple syrup, and the faint, underlying scent of industrial-strength cleaner, a testament to its constant bustling activity. Tonight, the evening rush was in full swing. Families with boisterous children occupied several tables, their laughter occasionally piercing the general din. Young couples huddled in corners, sharing milkshakes and quiet conversations. Elderly regulars sat at the counter, engaged in their nightly ritual of coffee and pie, and their faces illuminated by the warm glow of the neon sign outside. It was a tableau of ordinary life, reassuring in its predictability, until the discordant note of the bully's voice began to sour the melody. Ethan Vance, 38 years old, sat across from his son Leo, who was absorbed in painstakingly building a ketchup fortress around his burger patty. Ethan wore a faded flannel shirt, its sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle, and jeans that had seen better days but were clean and presentable. His hair, a dark brown streaked with a few premature silver strands at the temples, was neatly trimmed, and his eyes, a deep, unsettling shade of gray, held a profound stillness, even as the mockery intensified. He was a man who moved with a quiet efficiency, his presence often overlooked until one truly looked at him. There was a faint scar tracing the line of his jaw, a white mark against his tanned skin, and another, less visible, disappearing into the collar of his shirt. Small, almost imperceptible badges of a life lived far beyond the confines of suburban diners. Leo, with his bright, curious eyes and an unruly mop of sandy blonde hair that mirrored his mother's, was the spitting image of youthful innocence. He chatted animatedly about his day at school, about a particularly impressive tower he'd built with blocks, oblivious for the moment to the simmering tension that was beginning to congeal around their booth. His father's presence was his universe, and in it, he felt utterly safe, a feeling Ethan fought desperately to maintain. The initial snickers, subtle and seemingly innocuous, had quickly mutated into outright jeers. The leader of the group, a man with a heavy-set frame, a patchy goatee, and an unbuttoned shirt that revealed an ostentatious gold chain, leaned back in his booth, his eyes fixed on Ethan. Chad, as his friends occasionally called him, had the kind of boisterous confidence that bordered on aggressive arrogance, a man who seemed to believe his opinions were universal truths, and his presence a gift to all. Seriously, dude, who dresses like that for a dinner out? Chad sneered, his voice loud enough to carry. Not quite a shout, but certainly not a private remark. Flannel in a diner? What, did you just roll out of a logging camp? His friends guffawed, their laughter a rude, braying sound that pierced the general din, causing a few heads to turn briefly before quickly averting their gaze, choosing to ignore the obvious discomfort rather than risk becoming targets themselves. It was a common human failing, that instinct to recoil from conflict, to pretend not to notice, and Chad exploited it with practiced ease. Ethan felt the heat rise in his neck, a familiar warning signal, but he forced himself to take a deep, measured breath. Not now. Not here. Not in front of Leo. Asterisk. This internal mantra was a constant companion, a rigid governor on a powerful engine that, once unleashed, could be devastating. The problem wasn't merely the taunts about his attire or his marital status, though those were certainly aimed to wound. It was the insidious undertone, the way Chad made it clear that Ethan, as a single father, was somehow less than, a man deserving of pity or scorn. Each barb was designed to chip away at Ethan's dignity, to undermine his authority in front of his son, to suggest a weakness that Chad clearly relished exposing. Leo, his ketchup fortress now complete, looked up, his brow furrowed. "Dad?" he whispered, his voice small, picking up on the vibrations of hostility. "Are those men talking about us?" His innocent question was a dagger to Ethan's heart. He forced a reassuring smile, a monumental effort, given the raging storm beneath his calm exterior. "No, buddy, they're just talking loud. Don't worry about them. Eat your burger before it gets cold." He subtly shifted his body, partially shielding Leo from the direct line of sight of Chad's booth, a protective instinct honed by years of putting his son's well-being above all else. Why didn't Ethan react? Why didn't he just stand up, walk over, and shut Chad up? The questions hung unspoken in the air, mirrored in the furtive glances of other diners, who had now become acutely aware of the unpleasant scene unfolding. What kind of man could endure such blatant disrespect without so much as a flinch? What hidden depths lay beneath that almost unnerving calm? And what would happen if the bully, emboldened by Ethan's apparent non-response, decided to push his luck just a little bit further? There was a dangerous dance unfolding, a subtle test of wills. And for now, Ethan seemed content to let the aggressor lead, a strategy that puzzled and unnerved onlookers. He had been taught in environments far more hostile than a brightly lit diner that true strength often lay not in the immediate, visceral response, but in the calculated, patient observation, in understanding the opponent's weaknesses before making a move. But in a public diner with his son beside him, that training felt like a heavy chain, binding him. Chad, perceiving Ethan's silence as weakness, as confirmation of his own superior standing, grew bolder. He picked up his beer, took a long swig, and then leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly but still carrying. It's a real shame. Raising a kid all alone," he drawled, feigning sympathy with a cruel smirk. "Must be tough trying to do it all. Probably why you look so worn out. And why your kid's still playing with ketchup like he's 5. He chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound, then added, "Guess some guys just aren't cut out for the long haul, huh? Or maybe, just maybe, they're not even worth the short haul." This was a direct hit, aimed not just at Ethan's capabilities as a father, but at his very worth as a man, and by extension, at the circumstances that had led to him being a single parent. A vein throbbed faintly in Ethan's temple, a tiny betraying pulse of the rage coiling beneath his skin. He squeezed Leo's hand, a silent message of reassurance, of calm, even as his own fingers tightened imperceptibly. He remembered a dusty, sun-baked landscape, the deafening crack of a sniper rifle, the split-second decision that had saved lives but cost him something ineffable. He remembered the rigid discipline required to suppress every instinct, every natural human reaction in the face of chaos. This diner, this bully, was a pale imitation of true danger, but the stakes, for Leo, felt just as high. He had to maintain control. He had to model strength, not aggression. A waitress, her apron smeared with various sauces, hurried past, momentarily interrupting Chad's monologue as she delivered a towering plate of nachos to a nearby table. The brief lull in the taunts was not a reprieve, but merely a reset. Chad, momentarily deprived of an audience for his performance, puffed out his chest and caught the eye of one of his companions, a man who offered a sniveling smile of encouragement. The fleeting interruption only seemed to fuel Chad's need for attention. His internal clock reset, his appetite for cruelty undiminished. He cleared his throat dramatically, drawing attention back to himself, like a performer demanding the spotlight. Ethan, meanwhile, used the brief moment to wipe Leo's mouth again, his movements precise, almost mechanical. He could feel the eyes of other diners on them, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. He wondered if anyone would intervene. He knew deep down they wouldn't. It wasn't their fight. And his training had taught him to rely on no one but himself, a lesson etched into his very bones through blood and sacrifice. Suddenly, Chad pushed back from his booth, making a show of stretching, his eyes never leaving Ethan. He swaggered a few steps closer, closing the small gap between their tables, his bulky presence now casting a distinct shadow over Ethan's booth. His face was a mask of smirking disdain, a challenge burning in his eyes. "You know, I'm just trying to figure it out," he said, his voice now lower, more menacing, meant only for Ethan's ears, yet still carrying enough to ripple through the hushed diner. What kind of man just sits there taking all that? Not even a peep. No, you got nothing to say for yourself, tough guy? Or are you just too busy trying to keep that kid from realizing his old man's a total loser? He leaned closer, his breath reeking of stale beer and arrogance, washing over Ethan. "Yeah, that's it, isn't it? Don't want to show your kid how much of a spineless coward you really are?" He smirked, confident in his victory, certain he had finally broken through Ethan's facade. Leo, sensing the shift in proximity and the tone of Chad's voice, looked up at his father, his eyes wide with a fear that threatened to crack Ethan's composure entirely. In that instant, as Chad's putrid breath filled the small space and his words poisoned the air, something in Ethan snapped. Not outwardly, not in a visible explosion of anger, but deep within, a subtle tremor that only a keen observer would notice. His gray eyes, which had been carefully neutral, suddenly sharpened, hardening into chips of flint. The corners of his mouth, which had been held in a rigid line of forced calm, twitched almost imperceptibly, just enough to reveal a sliver of the immense effort it took to keep them from twisting into something predatory. And then he looked directly at Chad. It was not a glance of fear, nor of simple annoyance, nor even of rage. It was a look that seemed to bore straight through Chad, past the bluster and the cheap bravado, into something far more vulnerable, far more insignificant. It was the gaze of a man who had seen true monsters, who had faced down horrors that Chad couldn't even begin to imagine, and who, by comparison, found Chad utterly, pathetically unthreatening. For a fleeting moment, an almost imperceptible shiver ran down Chad's spine. The arrogance faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion, a nascent unease he couldn't quite articulate. The eyes staring back at him were ancient, filled with a cold, weary wisdom that spoke of battles fought and scars earned, not in some petty verbal spare in a diner, but in places where life and death hung in the balance with every breath. He had expected fear or anger, or at least some pathetic attempt at defiance. He had expected something he could recognize, something he could exploit. Instead, he met a silence that was heavier than any shout, a stillness that was more menacing than any threat. Chad, momentarily thrown off balance, let out a nervous, almost involuntary chuckle, trying to regain his footing. "What, got nothing to say for yourself, tough guy?" he repeated, though his voice lacked its previous conviction. He extended a hand, as if to lightly tap Ethan on the shoulder, a gesture meant to be patronizing, a final assertion of dominance. But as his fingers brushed the worn flannel, Ethan's entire body tensed, a coiled spring ready to unleash an unimaginable force. His shoulder muscles bunched, a momentary, almost superhuman rigidity that transferred a jolt through Chad's arm. And in that same split second, Ethan's left hand, which had been resting on the table, moved with a blinding speed, not to strike, but to deftly slide his son's plate just a fraction of an inch further from the table's edge. The movement was so fluid, so efficient, so utterly devoid of wasted motion, that it was terrifying. It wasn't the move of an average man. It was the precise, the economical action of someone whose every movement was calculated, refined through countless repetitions under extreme pressure. Chad felt a jolt of something primal, a gut instinct warning him that he had stumbled upon something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. The hand that had merely shifted a plate had moved with the silent, deadly grace of a predator. A fleeting, almost imperceptible shadow passed over Ethan's face, a flicker of something ancient and ruthless in his eyes, a brief opening of a portal to a world Chad had only seen in movies. Chad quickly withdrew his hand, his boisterous confidence suddenly deflated, replaced by a lingering, unsettling question mark. He barked a short, forced laugh, trying to dismiss the strange sensation, but the mirth didn't reach his eyes. He stumbled back to his own booth, so a vague sense of disquiet clinging to him like a bad smell. The encounter was over for now. Ethan Vance, the unassuming single dad, went back to quietly encouraging his son to finish his meal, his face once again a placid mask. But the air around table 7 was now charged with an unspoken tension, a silent promise that the peace was merely temporary. The bully had poked a sleeping giant, and though the giant still slumbered, it had stirred, its eyes briefly opening to reveal a terrifying, ancient power. The diner continued its nightly rhythm, but for those who had witnessed the subtle exchange, the comfortable hum now felt like a fragile barrier, separating the ordinary world from something far more complex, far more dangerous, lurking just beneath the surface. What was it that made Ethan Vance so different? What hidden past did those gray eyes conceal, and what would happen when the bully, inevitably, pushed too far again? The truth was far more profound and far more devastating than anyone in the Daily Dish could possibly imagine. Continue reading to uncover the astonishing truth behind Ethan Vance and the events that would follow this fateful encounter. The clatter of cutlery and the murmur of polite conversation, once a comforting backdrop to their shared meal, now seemed to amplify the discordant presence that had invaded their fragile bubble of peace. Mark felt the subtle shift in the restaurant's energy, an almost imperceptible tightening, like a collective holding of breath. Across the room, Chad, oblivious, or perhaps intentionally indifferent to the discomfort he sowed, leaned back in his chair, a sneer twisting his features as he gestured wildly with a half-eaten breadstick, addressing his cronies with booming laughter that ricocheted off the decorative brick walls. His voice, once merely an irritant, began to penetrate the careful shield Mark had erected, its self-important tenor now carrying distinct, derogatory snippets that Mark couldn't ignore, no matter how desperately he tried for Lily's sake. "Look at him," Chad slurred, though his words were perfectly articulate, cutting through the ambient noise like a sharpened blade. What a sad sack. Can't even control his own kid. The remark, clearly aimed at Mark and Lily, landed with a sickening thud, not just in Mark's ears, but in the periphery of Lily's innocent awareness. She was drawing a smiley face in the condensation on her glass, her small brow furrowed in concentration, but Mark saw her hand falter, her head tilt almost imperceptibly as if tuning into a frequency she didn't quite understand, but instinctively recoiled from. A wave of heat, cold, then pure, unadulterated protectiveness surged through Mark. It was an ancient, primal urge, honed to a deadly precision through years of specialized training, an instinct to neutralize threats, to eliminate obstacles that jeopardized his charge. For a fleeting, terrifying moment, the sterile, family-friendly atmosphere of Mama Rose's evaporated, replaced by the dust-choked, adrenaline-laced reality of a hostile environment. His peripheral vision mapped escape routes, identified potential improvised weapons, and assessed the threat profile of Chad and his sycophants. Loud, arrogant, but likely untrained soft. Sudden a flicker of a memory, sharp and unwelcome, crossed his mind. A similar situation, but with live rounds and the scent of cordite in the air. A different kind of enemy, but the same cold clarity of purpose. He suppressed it immediately, shoving it back into the mental compartment where he kept such things locked away. This was not that. This was different. This was Lily. He glanced at his daughter, her delicate features still obscured by the innocence of childhood, her small fingers now tracing aimlessly on the glass. The vibrant curiosity that usually animated her eyes had dimmed, replaced by a nascent confusion. Her lower lip protruded slightly, a telltale sign of her burgeoning unease. Mark's heart ached with a familiar blend of love and fierce determination. He had promised her a normal life, a quiet existence free from the shadows of his past, a stark contrast to the unforgiving world he had once inhabited. Every fiber of his being screamed to unleash the suppressed warrior within, to silence the taunts with a swift, decisive action that would leave Chad bewildered and perhaps in a state of regret for weeks. But that would not be normal. That would not be peaceful. That would not be for Lily. The urge to react honed over countless high-stakes operations where hesitation meant failure, now warred violently with the profound, almost sacred duty of paternal restraint. His jaw, usually relaxed, tightened imperceptibly, a muscle twitching beneath his close-cropped stubble. His hands resting on his lap beneath the table, clenched into fists, the knuckles turning white, the scar tissue on his right hand, a souvenir from a mission long ago, pulling taut against the skin. He could feel the familiar thrum of adrenaline, not a surge this time, but a steady, simmering current, a dangerous readiness that belied his outwardly calm demeanor. The years he had spent as an operator, pushing his body and mind to the very edge of human endurance, had conditioned him to be a weapon, precise and devastating. Now, he was forcing that weapon back into its sheath, the effort monumental. Chad, seemingly emboldened by Mark's silence, interpreted it as weakness. His voice grew louder, laced with a sneering mockery that grated on Mark's frayed nerves. "Some father," he scoffed, nudging one of his companions, who guffawed in agreement. "Can't even make his kid eat her greens? Probably lets her run wild, too. Bet he's one of those modern dads. All touchy-feely, no discipline." The words, though generic, felt intensely personal, a direct assault on Mark's identity as a parent, an identity he cherished above all else. The casual cruelty of the remark was amplified by the fact that Lily, now fully aware that the commotion was directed at them, had stopped her play altogether. Her small, luminous eyes met Mark's, wide and questioning, a flicker of hurt already beginning to bloom within their depths. "Daddy?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rising tide of Chad's bravado, a small hand reaching out to clutch Mark's forearm. Her touch was a powerful anchor, grounding him, reminding him of his purpose. He forced a smile, a challenging feat given the tempest brewing beneath his composed exterior. "It's okay, sweetie. Just some silly people talking too loud." His voice was low, steady, a practiced calm that didn't betray the internal earthquake he was experiencing. He gently squeezed her hand, a silent promise of protection. But Chad wasn't finished. He stood up, towering over his table, making a show of stretching, his gaze sweeping across the restaurant until it settled, once again on Mark. There was a challenge in his eyes, a desire to provoke a reaction, to assert dominance. "What's wrong, pal?" he called out, his voice carrying effortlessly. "Cat got your tongue? Or are you just too busy spoiling your kid rotten to teach her some manners?" The comment landed like a punch, not for Mark, who had faced far worse taunts under far worse conditions, but for Lily. She flinched, her small body recoiling slightly, and Mark felt a visceral tremor run through him. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about his daughter's peace, her sense of security. The controlled anger he had been meticulously managing began to fray at the edges. He could feel the cold, analytical part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive through countless close calls kick into overdrive. Every patron in the restaurant became a potential variable, every chair a projectile, every shadow a tactical advantage. He was unconsciously calculating trajectories, assessing vulnerabilities, his mind a whirlwind of contingency plans, all while maintaining the veneer of a tired, put-upon father. He remembered a particularly grueling training exercise in the sweltering heat of a desert camp, a drill designed to test an operator's ability to maintain situational awareness and lethal precision under extreme psychological pressure. Insults had been hurled, physical discomfort was constant, and the stakes, though simulated, felt terrifyingly real. He had learned then to compartmentalize, to let the noise wash over him, while his core self remained focused, lethal. But that was for a mission. This was personal. This was his child. The difference was immense. He watched Chad's body language, noting the swagger, the overly confident posture that masked an underlying insecurity. Chad's eyes darted around, seeking approval from his friends, from the few patrons who dared to meet his gaze. This wasn't true strength, it was performative aggression. A weak man's display. Mark knew true strength was quiet, unassuming, always ready, never boastful. It was in the silence, in the restraint. It was in the ability to walk away from a fight you could easily win. Yet the price of that silence was now being paid by Lily's diminishing joy. The waitress, a young woman named Sarah who had been serving their table with a gentle smile, approached Mark, her expression now a blend of sympathy and professional unease. She leaned in conspiratorially, her voice hushed. "Is everything all right, sir?" she whispered, glancing nervously towards Chad's table. I can speak to my manager if you'd like." Her concern, while appreciated, only highlighted the escalating nature of the problem. Mark appreciated the gesture, but knew instinctively that a manager's intervention would only further inflame Chad's ego, turning a loud annoyance into a full-blown spectacle, and something he desperately wished to spare Lily. "We're fine, thank you," Mark replied, his voice calm despite the raw tension simmering beneath. He offered her a reassuring smile, a subtle nod that conveyed his gratitude and his desire to handle it himself. He didn't want to draw more attention. Not yet. Not while Lily was still clinging to the illusion of a normal meal. He knew, with an operator's certainty, that the situation was building, accumulating pressure like a fault line. Chad was pushing, testing boundaries, escalating, and Mark, for Lily's sake, was absorbing it, allowing the psychological jabs to land, letting them bounce off the impenetrable armor of his self-control. But the armor was beginning to crack. Every time Chad's obnoxious laugh echoed, every time a new snide remark drifted their way, another fissure appeared. Lily's bright eyes, which moments ago had sparkled with the simple joy of an outing with her dad, were now clouded with a quiet distress. She leaned into Mark, her small head resting against his arm, seeking comfort, protection. It was the physical manifestation of her fear, and it struck Mark harder than any insult Chad could hurl. He could endure anything, absorb any amount of abuse, but to see his daughter suffer because of his past choices, his inability to completely shed the shadow of who he once was, or perhaps more accurately, because of his current choice to not be that man, was intolerable. He felt the familiar urge to scan the room again, not for threats this time, but for exits, for ways to extricate Lily from this increasingly uncomfortable situation without causing a scene. He mentally replayed the layout of Mama Rose's, kitchen doors, restrooms, the main entrance. He considered the quickest, least disruptive route out, even if it meant leaving their half-eaten meals behind. But then he remembered Lily's excitement about the special spaghetti sauce, her anticipation of the dessert. To cut short their meal would be to admit defeat, to allow Chad's bullying to win, to spoil a simple pleasure he worked so hard to provide. And that, in its own way, was unacceptable. He wouldn't let a loudmouth bully dictate their joy. He took a deep breath, the scent of garlic and baking dough filling his lungs, a stark contrast to the sterile metallic tang of fear and determination that had once been his constant companion. He glanced around the restaurant, noting the expressions of the other patrons. Some averted their eyes, now embarrassed. Others cast pitying glances his way. A few whispered amongst themselves, clearly annoyed by Chad's antics, but unwilling to intervene. It was a microcosm of society, he thought, the willing silence enabling the aggressor. He knew this dynamic well, had seen it play out in different forms in far more dangerous arenas. The silence of the bystanders often empowered the perpetrator more than any direct confrontation. Chad, perceiving the general inaction as tacit approval, puffed out his chest even further. He took a theatrical sip of his drink, then slammed the glass down on the table with a loud clatter, causing several diners to jump. Honestly, he declared, his voice cutting through the restaurant, if you're going to bring a kid out, at least make sure they're not a public nuisance. So some people just shouldn't be parents. This was it. This was the line. Not just a slight, but a direct, judgmental condemnation of Mark's fitness as a father. And it was delivered with such callous disregard for the child present. Mark's internal dam, holding back years of disciplined aggression, decades of learned control, began to buckle. The tremor in his hands intensified. His eyes, usually an unremarkable shade of brown, darkened perceptibly, acquiring an intensity that could only be described as predatory. His breathing, though still shallow and controlled, became slightly more audible, a barely perceptible hiss through his nostrils. The air around their table seemed to thicken, charged with a palpable tension. Lily, sensing the shift, looked up at her father, her small face etched with apprehension. Nay, but also with an unwavering trust. That trust, more than anything, was what held Mark in check, suspended precariously on the precipice of a silent, devastating fury. He was a father first, always. But the legend, the ghost of the man he once was stirring slowly, reluctantly, at the very core of his being. The surface calm was an illusion, paper-thin, stretched taut over an abyss of barely restrained power. The clock was ticking. Something had to give. The air in the bustling restaurant, once filled with the cheerful cacophony of weekend diners, had congealed into something thick and suffocating around their small table. David, his hand still gently resting on Lily's trembling shoulder, felt the familiar surge of protective instinct, a primal roar that echoed from a past he had painstakingly buried under layers of domesticity and quiet resilience. He watched as the bully, a man whose sense of self-importance seemed to inflate with every syllable, leaned forward, his voice dropping, though still loud enough to carry through the increasingly hushed room. "Look at him," the bully sneered, a dismissive flick of his wrist directed at David. "Can't even afford a decent meal for his kid. Probably one of those struggling artists or freelancers who think showing up in a worn-out flannel shirt makes them deep. Pathetic." He then turned his gaze to Lily, a cruel, mocking smile stretching across his lips. "And you, little girl, is this what your dad usually serves you? Leftovers? Because if he can't even provide a proper meal, what can he provide? No, probably can't even throw a ball properly, can he? Too busy wallowing in his self-pity?" The words struck David like a physical blow, not for himself, but for the innocent, vulnerable child beside him. Lily's small frame stiffened, her eyes, wide and glistening with unshed tears, darted from the bully's sneering face to her father's stoic profile. The last vestige of her innocent mealtime joy evaporated, replaced by a shame she didn't deserve to feel. David's grip on her shoulder tightened almost imperceptibly, a silent promise of protection, a desperate attempt to absorb the venom aimed at her. Inside him, the carefully constructed walls began to fissure. He had faced down enemies in sun-baked deserts and frozen mountains, men whose intentions were unequivocally lethal, whose faces were contorted by hatred and fanaticism. He had navigated treacherous political landscapes where betrayal was a currency, and every word a potential weapon. Yet this petty, public humiliation inflicted upon his daughter by a man whose only weapon was his inflated ego and a disregard for basic human decency, felt like a uniquely insidious assault. It was a different kind of battlefield, one where the rules of engagement he knew so well were utterly useless. He couldn't neutralize the threat with swift, surgical precision. He couldn't assess the tactical advantages of the terrain or the enemy's weakness. He was a father, constrained by the societal expectations of a peaceful civilian, his primary objective to shield his child. not to engage in a confrontation that would only further traumatize her. A memory flashed, sharp and vivid, unbidden. The dust-choked air of a compound in a forgotten corner of the world, the acrid smell of cordite, the guttural screams of men. He remembered the razor-thin line between calculated aggression and uncontrolled rage, a line he had walked for years, always on the right side of it, always precise, always effective. He remembered the chilling clarity that descended upon him in moments of extreme peril, stripping away all superfluous thought, leaving only the objective, the mission, the absolute necessity of survival for himself and his team. Now, that same clarity began to descend, but it was tempered, constrained by the innocent life he cherished more than his own. He felt the tremors in Lily's small hand, heard the small, hitching sound in her breath. Her lower lip began to tremble uncontrollably, and he knew, with a dreadful certainty, that she was on the verge of tears. That was it. That was the line. He could endure mockery, dismissive comments about his clothes, his perceived status, his parenting. He could even endure the questioning of his ability to provide. But to cause his child pain, to make her feel inadequate or ashamed, was an unforgivable transgression. A low murmur rippled through the restaurant. Waitstaff exchanged uneasy glances. Patrons who had initially tried to pretend nothing was happening now cast uncomfortable looks at the bully, some even offering David sympathetic, if hesitant, eye contact. One man, a burly figure in a lumberjack shirt at a nearby booth, started to push his chair back, a clear sign of impending intervention. David, with a subtle shift of his weight, a nearly imperceptible tilt of his head, caught the man's eye. A silent message passed between them. Hold. It was a habit, an instinct honed over decades, assessing threats, controlling the environment, managing potential variables. The burly man, sensing something in David's gaze, something beyond mere passive suffering, hesitated, then slowly settled back into his seat, though his attention remained fixed on the unfolding drama. The bully, emboldened by David's continued silence, mistook it for cowardice, for resignation. See, he crowed, gesturing dramatically at David. Absolutely nothing. Can't even string a coherent sentence together to defend himself, let alone his kid. What a joke. Some dad you got there, sweetie. You deserve better, much better. Someone who isn't afraid to stand up for himself. Someone who actually knows how to provide. He let out a condescending chuckle, a sound that grated on every nerve David possessed. This man, with his petty cruelty, his grandstanding, his utter lack of self-awareness, was about to make the gravest mistake of his life. Little did he know that the man he was mocking, the man he had dismissed as a weak, struggling parent, was forged from a different kind of steel altogether. David had witnessed horrors that would shatter the average psyche, had made decisions under duress that determined the fate of nations, had operated in the shadows, where the lines between life and death were razor thin and constantly shifting. He had walked away from that life, not because he was weak, but because he had chosen a different kind of strength, the strength to embrace peace, to nurture, to be present for his daughter. But that did not mean the dormant beast within had forgotten how to stir. David's gaze, previously soft and unfocused, now sharpened, taking on a cold, predatory glint that few had ever seen and lived to tell about. It was the look of a hunter who had finally decided to engage, the calm before the storm. He took a slow, deliberate breath, the kind of breath he used to take before breaching a target door, before a high-stakes parachute jump into hostile territory, before the world descended into chaos, and he was the quiet, lethal eye of the storm. His shoulders, which had seemed slightly slumped in a posture of weary patience, subtly squared. The fabric of his flannel shirt, seemingly so innocuous, now stretched taut over muscles honed by years of rigorous training, muscles that held an incredible, contained power. His mind, no longer grappling with restraint, began to execute a silent, internal sequence. Assess the threat. A loud-mouthed civilian, no apparent physical training, relying on bluster and public shame. Assess the environment. A crowded restaurant, potential for collateral damage, need to contain the situation quickly and decisively, minimizing impact on Lily and other patrons. Assess the objective. Silence the bully. Remove the threat to Lily's peace. Ensure this man understood the gravity of his transgression without resorting to disproportionate force that would betray David's commitment to his new life. His eyes, which had been fixed on the bully, now flickered almost imperceptibly around the room, taking in exits, potential obstacles, the positions of other diners. It was a habit, an ingrained operational scanning that he couldn't turn off. Not even after years away from active duty, the bully, in his self-absorbed tirade, didn't notice the subtle shift, the transformation taking place before his very eyes. He just saw the quiet man, still seated, still seemingly doing nothing. He saw a target. Still nothing, huh? The bully scoffed, his voice rising again, a triumphal note entering his tone. He leaned even further across the divide between their tables, invading their personal space, his face mere inches from David's. Just going to sit there and take it? Let everyone see what a spineless excuse for a father you are? You know, people like you're just dead weight. You drag society down. You can't even look me in the eye, can you? Probably too ashamed of yourself. David finally, slowly lifted his head. His eyes met the bully's. The bully, for the first time, faltered, and the sneer on his face momentarily flickered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. There was no anger in David's eyes, no fear, no shame. There was only an unnerving, absolute calm, a depth that seemed to absorb all light and sound. It was the gaze of a man who had stared into the abyss and found it boring. A man who understood violence intimately, not as an expression of emotion, but as a tool, a precise instrument. The temperature in the restaurant seemed to drop several degrees. The clinking of cutlery, the soft hum of conversation, the ambient background noise, all of it seemed to fade, replaced by a profound silence that descended upon their corner of the room. Lily, sensing the shift, looked up at her father, her tears momentarily forgotten, replaced by a curious awe. She had never seen her gentle dad look quite like this, and David's voice, when it finally came, was a low, resonant rumble, utterly devoid of emotion, yet carrying a weight that commanded attention. It was a voice that had delivered commands under fire, a voice accustomed to being obeyed without question. It was not loud, but it cut through the lingering silence like a surgeon's scalpel. "You have pushed your luck," David stated, each word delivered with the precise impact of a hammer blow. "And you have crossed a line." There was no threat in his tone, no bluster, just a simple, unadorned declaration of fact. It was not a warning. It was an announcement of inevitability. The bully, still trying to process the sudden, chilling authority in David's voice, felt a primal, instinctual fear begin to gnaw at the edges of his bravado. He opened his mouth, perhaps to retort, perhaps to laugh it off. But no sound came out. David had not moved, not an inch, yet the entire dynamic of the confrontation had irrevocably shifted. The hunter had become the hunted, and the bully finally, subconsciously, began to sense the icy breath of a predator behind him. The sudden, unexpected sound of a chair scraping sharply against the polished floor, accompanied by a muffled thud, sliced through the tense silence that had momentarily fallen over the restaurant. It was Chad, having stumbled back, his face a mask of disbelief and fear, his eyes wide and fixed on the man who stood before him, with a stillness that was both unsettling and profoundly dangerous. Ethan hadn't moved much. A fractional shift of weight, a subtle repositioning, but it was enough. Enough to convey an unspoken message of coiled power and of a physical competence far beyond what any civilian possessed. The small group of onlookers, including the manager who had finally arrived, looked on with bated breath, their initial amusement having curdled into genuine concern, or perhaps a morbid fascination. Chad's bluster had vanished, replaced by a tremor that ran through his entire frame. He had reached out not with aggression, but with an almost involuntary flinch, as if to ward off an invisible blow, after Ethan's voice had dropped to that almost imperceptible whisper. That voice, devoid of any discernible threat, yet imbued with an intensity that seemed to vibrate through the very air, had spoken volumes. It wasn't the words themselves, though they were chillingly clear. You have precisely 3 seconds to retract every single word you've uttered and apologize, or you will understand, in a way you cannot possibly comprehend, the true meaning of regret, but the absolute, unwavering conviction behind them. It was the calm before a storm so profound, so utterly devastating, that it froze even Chad's thick-headed arrogance. 1 second passed, marked only by the frantic pulse thrumming in Chad's ears. He wanted to retort, to find some last vestige of his bravado, but his throat was dry, and the words caught like thorns. His gaze flickered from Ethan's unwavering eyes to Lily, who, despite her father's intimidating posture, seemed to be watching him with a quiet, almost sad understanding. The absurdity of his own position, bullying a child and her father, suddenly washed over him, not with remorse, but with a cold, terrifying clarity of the consequences. He had overstepped irrevocably. No, 2 seconds. The manager, a portly man named Mr. Harrison, finally found his voice. Sir, please, let's not escalate this further. We can resolve this peacefully. He was addressing Ethan, mistaking his quiet intensity for mere anger. He hadn't seen the subtle shift in Ethan's stance, the way his muscles seemed to ripple beneath his simple t-shirt, not with tension but with readiness. It was the stance of someone who had trained for a lifetime to move with economy and lethal precision. 3 seconds. The air in the restaurant thickened, becoming almost suffocating. Just as Chad began to open his mouth, perhaps to mumble some half-hearted apology, a new voice cut through the silence. It was a deep, resonant voice, imbued with the unmistakable gravitas of authority, and it came from a distinguished-looking man seated at a nearby table, now one who had been quietly observing the entire ordeal. This man, with silver hair and keen, intelligent eyes that had clearly seen much, now slowly pushed back his own chair and stood up. "Chadwick, you fool," the man stated, his voice carrying effortlessly. He didn't raise it, but every word resonated with a weight that commanded attention. "Do you truly have no idea who you're speaking to?" Chad turned, his eyes wide, recognizing the man with a jolt. General Maxwell?" he stammered, the name catching in his throat like a fishbone. The general, a decorated veteran known for his unwavering integrity and formidable presence, was a figure of immense respect, even fear, in certain circles. General Maxwell ignored Chad, his gaze now fixed on Ethan. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face, a smile of recognition and, perhaps, saw of profound admiration. "Ethan Vance," he said, the name rolling off his tongue with a reverence that sent a shiver down the spines of those who heard it. "I should have known. The only man I ever saw who could make a tactical withdrawal from a hot zone look like a leisurely stroll through a park. Still as sharp as ever, I see." The name hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history. Ethan Vance. For a moment it meant nothing to the general public in the restaurant. But then, a few whispers started. "Ethan Vance? Is that the Ethan Vance?" A young man glued to his phone suddenly gasped, frantically scrolling through search results. The manager, Mr. Harrison, looked from the general to Ethan, his face paling as understanding began to dawn. General Maxwell stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Ethan's. "Chadwick here is too young, too arrogant, and frankly, too ignorant to know the difference between a real man and the pathetic excuses he spends his days trying to emulate. But some of us remember. Some of us remember what quiet professionals truly means." He paused, letting the implication sink in. "This man, Chadwick, who you just mocked for being a single father, for trying to raise his daughter with dignity. This is the man who single-handedly secured the release of 36 hostages from a terrorist stronghold in Syria under conditions that conventional forces deemed impossible. This is the man who spent 5 years deep undercover, dismantling a global arms trafficking network from the inside, a mission that saved countless lives and reshaped the geopolitical landscape." Each word from the general's lips was a hammer blow, shattering Chad's world. Now the whispers in the restaurant intensified, transforming into murmurs of awe and disbelief. The young man with the phone held it up, displaying an article with a grainy photo of a younger, grim-faced Ethan in combat fatigues. The headline blaring, "Delta Force legend Ethan Vance honored for unprecedented valor." He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, not for one act of heroism, but for a career defined by impossible feats, by an unwavering commitment to duty, honor, and country, often at the cost of his own safety, his own peace. General Maxwell continued, his voice now imbued with a somber pride. And he did it all in the shadows, asking for no glory, no recognition, only to disappear back into anonymity, seeking nothing more than a quiet life. The general's gaze swept over the stunned patrons. He chose to be a father, a good man after serving his nation in ways most of us can only dream of. And you, Chadwick, dared to mock him, to belittle him, for the very sacrifices that made your comfortable life possible. Chad's face was now crimson, not with anger, but with overwhelming shame and terror. The full weight of his colossal misjudgment crushed him. He had picked a fight with a ghost, a legend, a man whose quiet demeanor hid a past of such profound heroism and lethal capability that it rendered him, Chad, utterly insignificant. His knees felt weak, threatening to give out. He looked at Ethan again, no longer seeing a deadbeat dad, but a formidable, almost mythic figure, whose restrained power now seemed to radiate outward, filling the entire room. Ethan, for his part, remained impassive throughout the general's impromptu eulogy. His eyes, however, mine had softened fractionally as General Maxwell spoke, a ghost of an acknowledgement for a past he had long tried to keep buried. He didn't relish the attention, but he also recognized the necessity of this moment. For Lily, if for no one else. Sir, Mr. Vance, I am so incredibly sorry, Mr. Harrison, the manager stammered, his face ashen. He practically bowed, his previous attempts to maintain order dissolving into abject apology. I had no idea. Please allow me to escort this individual out immediately. Your meal, of course, is on the house, for as long as you wish to dine with us, and we are profoundly honored to have you. He gestured frantically to a waiting waiter, who immediately moved to Chad's side. Chad, humiliated beyond measure, didn't resist. He was a broken man, his swagger and arrogance utterly annihilated. He avoided eye contact with everyone as he was gently but firmly guided towards the exit. The stares of the other patrons, a mixture of disgust, pity, and fervent relief that they hadn't been in his shoes, burned into his back. His pathetic retreat was a stark contrast to his earlier boisterous entrance, a truly fitting end to his reign of terror over the restaurant. As the door swung shut behind Chad, leaving an abrupt silence in its wake, General Maxwell turned back to Ethan, extending a hand. It's good to see you, son, though I suppose you'd prefer not to be recognized. Ethan met his gaze, a genuine, understated smile finally gracing his lips. He clasped the general's hand firmly. General, always a pleasure. And I suppose some battles just can't be fought quietly, can they? He glanced down at Lily, who was now beaming, her eyes shining with pride and adoration for her father. The fear had completely dissipated, replaced by a radiant joy. This was the moment she truly understood the depth of her father's quiet strength, the incredible man he was not just to her, but to the world. No, some battles need to be fought in the open, if only to remind the complacent what true courage looks like, General Maxwell replied, nodding towards Lily. You've got a wonderful daughter, Ethan. You're doing a fine job. With that, the general offered a respectful nod to Ethan and a warm smile to Lily before returning to his own table, leaving Ethan and Lily once more as the focal point of the restaurant. But this time, surrounded by an atmosphere of profound respect and quiet admiration. The waitress, who had been observing the entire scene with a mix of fear and growing awe, now approached their table tentatively. Mr. Vance, Lily, she said, her voice soft and deferential. Can I get you anything else? Perhaps some dessert for Lily on us? Lily, still glowing, looked at her father. Ethan smiled. That would be wonderful, thank you. He looked at Lily, his eyes conveying a silent message of love and reassurance. You okay, kiddo? Lily nodded, snuggling into her father's side. I'm more than okay, Dad. You're the best. Ethan gently ruffled her hair. He might have been a Delta Force legend, a man who had faced down unimaginable horrors and emerged victorious. But in that moment, sitting with his daughter in a now hushed, respectful restaurant. He was simply Lily's dad. And that, he realized, was the greatest honor of all. At the quiet life he had sought, the peace he had yearned for, was right here, in the unwavering love of his child, a love strong enough to overshadow any shadow from his past. The world might finally know his story, but only a precious few would truly understand the quiet strength that allowed him to choose a life of simple fatherhood over the roar of battle. How do you think we can cultivate more respect and understanding in our daily interactions, and challenge those who are quick to judge others based on superficial assumptions? Share your thoughts on what constitutes true strength and the impact of quiet heroism.